The summer of 1967 burned Cibola County, New Mexico, like a pan left on a stove. By the third week of June, the soil cracked along lines so straight they looked measured. Gus Alderete stood at the edge of his bean field on a Monday morning and looked at what 3 weeks without rain had done to 7 acres he'd planted in the first week of May. The leaves had curled inward. The stems were still upright but leaning, the way a man leans when he's been standing too long. Gus was 58 years old, had been farming this same ground outside Grants since 1941. 26 years on the same 140 acres. The soil was gray-brown sandy loam over caliche, drained fast when it rained and baked hard when it didn't. Gus had learned its character the way you learn a difficult neighbor, not by liking it, but by watching it long enough to know what it would do. The field smelled of dry dust and the faint bitterness of stressed plants pulling their last reserves upward. He walked 3 rows in, knelt down, pressed his palm flat against the soil surface. It was hot, not warm, hot, like a skillet left in the sun. The county extension agent, a man named Philip Sorrell, had driven out twice that spring. Sorrell was 34 years old, 2 years in the county seat at Grants, transferred from Bernalillo, where the land was different. He had brochures from the New Mexico State University Agricultural Station about drought-resistant bean varieties and irrigation scheduling. He'd left them on the kitchen table both times. Gus had read them, put them in the drawer. The problem wasn't variety. The problem wasn't scheduling. The problem was that the ground couldn't hold what little water came to it. Rain fell in Cibola County the way it always had in brief, hard events that arrived without warning and left before the soil could absorb them. The top 2 inches would wet and then seal as it dried. A crust. The water below the crust stayed separate from the surface. The bean roots lived in between, in a zone that dried fastest of all. Gus had been fighting this pattern for 26 years. Different plantings, different varieties, timing adjustments. He'd laid crop residue 2 years running. It helped some, not enough. His neighbor to the south, Ray Montoya, ran about 200 acres of the same soil type and had installed drip irrigation in 1964. Cost him $1,400 for the main field. He'd borrowed against his equipment to do it. His yields were steadier than the county average. Gus had looked at the setup 3 times, had done the math. He didn't have $1,400 in credit he was willing to put against uncertain bean prices. Ray had mentioned the drip system again at the feed store in late May, mentioned it to the other men standing there, not directly to Gus. But in the way men talk in feed stores, it was directed at Gus. Gus drove home, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table. His wife Elena was in the garden at the side of the house. She kept a kitchen garden, 30 feet by 40 feet, that had never once failed. Tomatoes, squash, chiles, a little corn in the back. Gus had watched her water it for 26 years and noticed, without ever thinking about it directly, that she used less water than he'd have expected, and still got more out of it than he'd have thought possible. He looked out the window at the garden. Then he went outside and looked at it differently. The garden soil was darker than the field soil. It held color longer after Alina had been working a particular section along the east wall of the house where the soil was a different texture altogether, looser, more forgiving, and the plants there showed it. Gus knelt down beside a row of tomato plants and looked at what was around the base of the stems. Alina used rocks as border markers, had for flat sandstone pieces, some the size of a dinner plate, some smaller, placed around the base of each plant and along the row edges. She'd collected them from the arroyo that cut along the south edge of the property. Gus had helped her carry them up 15 years ago, without thinking much about it. He pressed his hand to the soil directly under one of the flat stones. It was cool, noticeably cool. He moved his hand to the uncovered soil 6 inches away. Dry, crusted, hot. He sat back on his heels and thought about that for a while. The stones were doing something. He didn't have the word for it yet. What he had was the temperature difference and 26 years of watching difficult soil behave in ways he couldn't always explain. Gus went to the shed and found a trowel. Came back to the garden. Lifted one of Alana's flat sandstone pieces and pushed the trowel into the soil beneath. It went in 3 inches without resistance. He pulled the trowel out, moved to the adjacent uncovered soil, pushed again. It stopped at 1 inch, crusted hard. He dug a small hole under the stone. The soil at 2 inches depth was dark with moisture. He dug an adjacent hole in the uncovered section, gray and dry at the same depth. He put the stone back exactly where it had been. He went inside and told Alina he needed to borrow her rock, not all of them, most of them. She looked at him for a moment, said she'd need the ones by the tomatoes back by fall. He said that was fine. The following morning, Gus drove the pickup down to the arroyo. He had 2 wooden crates in the truck bed, the kind used for apple transport, each about 24 inches long and 16 inches wide. He spent 4 hours in the arroyo collecting flat sandstone. Most were between 6 and 14 inches across, 1 inch to 2 inches thick. He hauled 3 truckloads before noon. By early afternoon, he had a pile in the yard roughly 4 feet high and 8 feet wide. He sat on the bumper of the truck and drank water from a tin cup. Looked at the pile. Philip Sorrell from the extension office drove by on the county road that afternoon. Slowed down, pulled into the drive. Got out and looked at the pile of rocks and asked Gus what he was building. Gus told him he wasn't building anything. Sorrell looked at the pile again, asked what the rocks were for. Gus told him he was going to put them in the bean field. Sorrell didn't say much to that. He had a look that went with his silence. The look men get when they've decided not to argue with something they've already concluded is pointless. He mentioned, before leaving, that M-Sue had a new irrigation cost-share program Gus might want to look into. Left a brochure on the hood of the truck. Gus put the brochure in the glove box. Word moved the way it always does in a county of 23,000 people. By the end of that week, 3 different men had mentioned the rocks to Gus at the co-op in Grants. Not asked about them directly, mentioned them in the way that made clear they'd been talking about it. One of them, a rancher named Curtis Hale, said that in his experience the only thing rocks grew was more rocks. Gus bought his supplies and drove home. He started on the east end of the bean field on a Thursday morning in late June. The beans were still alive. Stressed, but alive. He began placing flat stones between the rows, spacing them so they covered roughly 60% of the surface area between plants. Not in a pattern. Just flat stones, one next to another, close enough that the gaps were small. He worked in the early morning hours. Started at 5:30, when the air was still cool and the ground hadn't yet absorbed the day's heat. He carried stones in a canvas feed sack slung over one shoulder, about 30 pounds at a time, setting them down by hand in the inter-row space. Each stone went flat side down. Tilted stones let water run off. Flat stones caught it and held it in place long enough to sink. The work was slow. He could cover about 40 feet of row length per hour. 7 acres meant approximately 4,800 linear feet of row. He worked 6 hours a day. Alina's youngest brother, Toms, came out 2 Saturdays running and helped without being asked. By the end of the 3rd week of work, Gus had covered 3.2 acres. Toms hadn't said anything while they worked, just carried stones and set them down. On his second Saturday, driving back to Grants in the afternoon, he stopped at the co-op and mentioned to the men there that Gus had put rock between his bean rows. Said it matter-of-factly. Didn't editorialize. The men at the co-op did that part themselves. The temperature that July ran to 97 degrees on 11 separate days. July rainfall, 0.6 inches total. One event, quick and light, that wet the road dust and evaporated before noon. Gus checked soil moisture on a Wednesday morning in mid-July. He used a length of half-inch steel rod he'd had for years, sharpened on one end. He pushed it into the mulch. It went to 8 inches without serious resistance. He pulled it out and pushed it into the unmulched section. Stopped at 2.5 inches. He wrote both numbers on the back of an envelope and put the envelope in his shirt pocket. The unmulched half of the field, 3.8 acres, needed water. The bean plants there had stalled. New leaf growth had stopped. Some of the lower leaves. Gus ran the irrigation pipe from the stock tank to that section for 3 hours on a Friday evening. 2,200 gallons. About 580 gallons per acre. The mulched section he did not irrigate. Not that week. By the end of July, the mulched section had received no supplemental water since the stones went down. The unmulched section had been irrigated. The plants in the mulched section were visibly fuller, not dramatically, but fuller. The leaf color was darker green. Growth had continued through the heat events when the unmulched section had stalled. Curtis Hale, the rancher who had said at the co-op that rocks only grow more rocks, drove past the property 3 times in July. Gus knew because Hale's truck was distinctive, a red Dodge D100, with a cracked right running board that he'd been meaning to fix since 1964. Each time, the truck slowed at the field boundary. Didn't stop. Sped up again after a moment. Ray Montoya came over on a Sunday in early August. Said he'd been driving by and noticed the field looked different. Stood at the edge and looked for a while. Asked what Gus had put down between the rows. Gus told him. Ray looked at the rocks for a while longer. Didn't say much. Drove home. Sorrell came back in mid-August. He'd been making his regular farm visits through the county. He walked the field boundary with Gus and asked questions. Looked at his notepad. Asked about the irrigation schedule. Gus showed him the irrigation log he kept in a small wire-bound notebook. Dates, duration, volume pulled from the tank. The mulch section had 1 entry, 0. The unmulched section had 4. Sorrell looked at the plant condition in both sections for a long time without speaking. He wrote something in his notepad. Asked Gus where he'd read about this method. Gus said he hadn't read about it anywhere. Sorrell wrote something else. Closed his notepad. Said he'd be back in September. The beans were ready in the 3rd week. Gus started harvesting on a Tuesday morning when the dew had burned off. He used a 2-row pull-behind harvester, an older International harvester unit he bought used in 1959 and kept in reasonable working condition with parts from a dealer in Albuquerque. He calibrated the weight scales on the wagon before starting. He ran the unmulched section first. 3.8 acres. Finished in a day and a half. Then he moved to the mulched section. The difference was visible from the seat of the tractor before the harvester took the first row. The plant canopy was denser. The pods were set more uniformly. Gus had been harvesting beans long enough to read a field the way a good butcher reads an animal. He could see the yield before the scale. The scale told him anyway, at the end of the 3rd day. Unmulched section, 1,640 pounds per acre. The county average that drought year was 1,520 pounds per acre. Gus had beaten the average, but only by the margin he typically held over average years. Mulched section, 2,380 pounds per acre. He sat in the tractor cab and looked at the number on the wagon scale for a long time. Added it again by hand on the back of the same envelope, where he'd written the moisture probe numbers in July. The arithmetic came out the same. He drove the tractor back to the shed, unhitched the harvester, washed his hands at the spigot on the side of the barn. The water ran gray with bean dust. He stood there after the water was clear, looking at his hands. He went. Alina had dinner ready. He sat down and ate, told her the numbers. She nodded, passed him the bread. That fall, Gus collected another 6 truckloads of stone from the arroyo. His son-in-law, Marco, brought a flatbed from Grant's on a Saturday and hauled a significant load from a rock pile on the edge of a ranch where the owner had been clearing land and didn't want them. That cost Gus. By November, he had enough material to cover the full 7 acres. He spent 3 weeks in October and November completing the coverage, working 4 hours each morning before the cold set in. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees on the morning of November 9th. He wore a canvas jacket and gloves with the fingers cut off so he could feel the stone faces and choose the flat ones without stopping to look at each one. By December 1st, all 7 acres had stone mulch between the rows, depth about 2 inches, over roughly 65% of the surface area. The total weight of material on the field, by his rough calculation from the truckload measurements, was somewhere between 18 and 22 tons. Sorel came back as he'd said he would. Brought a colleague from MSU's agricultural station in Las Cruces, a soil scientist named Dr. Margaret Funke, who had driven up specifically to look at the field. She walked the rows with a probe and a moisture meter and a notepad, and spent 3 hours making measurements. Gus walked with her and answered her questions. She was methodical, measured soil temperature at surface level and at 4-inch depth in both mulched and unmulched sections, recorded moisture at 2, 4, and 6 inches, photographed the stone placement from multiple angles, asked Gus about the source material, what type of stone, where he'd collected it, how he'd selected for size and shape. She crouched down and turned several pieces over, looking at the flat undersides. She asked where he'd learned the method. He told her he'd gotten it from his wife's garden. She wrote that down, looked up, asked him to say it again. He did. She wrote it down a second time. Dr. Funke's field notes from that visit were incorporated into a technical bulletin, NMSU, published in 1970 on evaporation suppression methods in arid zone. Gus Alderetti was referenced as a cooperating producer. The bulletin noted that the stone mulch plots he'd established showed a 45% reduction in supplemental irrigation need compared to unmulched controls on the same soil type, with a yield advantage of 31%. Under drought conditions. Sorel never said he'd been wrong, never used those words. He came out the following spring, April 1968, and watched Gus prepare the field for planting. Stayed for 2 hours. Took a lot of notes. Asked detailed questions about stone selection, placement spacing, depth. Wrote it all down as if it were a technical protocol, which by then it was Gus had developed, documented in the wire-bound notebook in precise and functional terms. The protocol covered stone dimensions minimum 5 inches across, maximum 16, thickness between 3/4 of an inch and 2 inches. Selection criteria, flat on both faces, no significant curvature. Placement depth, seated flush to soil surface, not raised. Coverage target, 60 to 70% of inter-row area. Material source, fractured sedimentary stone preferred over rounded stream gravel. Gus had arrived at each of these specifications through trial, not theory. The 1967 season had been the trial. The wire-bound notebook was the result. Sorel copied the protocol into his own notepad, word for word. left without. Before leaving, Sorrell mentioned that 2 other producers in the county had asked him about the method after hearing about the 1967 yield results. He asked if Gus would be willing to have them visit. Gus said they were welcome any time. The 1968 season ran better than 1967. Adequate rainfall for the region, 8.4 inches from May. The stone mulch made less of a visible difference in yield that year. The benefit was most pronounced under stress. Gus had expected that. He noted it in the wire-bound notebook and kept the stones in place. 1969 was dry again. Not as severe as 1967, but close. July and August combined, 1.1 inches. Mulched section yield, 2,290 pounds per acre. County average, 1,480. The gap held. By 1971, 4 other farms in Cibola County had laid stone mulch on portions of their fields. 2 were neighbors who'd visited Gus's operation. One had learned about it through NEMSU's extension materials, which by then referenced the 1967 trial. One had read about it independently and then called Gus to ask specific questions about stone type and spacing. Gus talked with all of them as long as they wanted. Showed them the wire-bound notebooks. He had 3 by then, going back to 1967. Showed them the moisture probe records, the yield logs, the irrigation tallies. Curtis Hale was not among the 4. He stopped by the field anyway, in the fall of 1971. When Gus was out checking fence on the south boundary, they talked for about 20 minutes at the gate. Hale looked at the field for most of that time, asked a few questions about where Gus was getting his stone, did not refer to what he'd said at the co-op in 1967. Did not need to. Gus didn't bring it up either. Hale's bean patch, 12 acres on the east side of his ranch, went under stone the following spring. He collected material from a dry creek bed on his own land. Drove past Gus's field twice that summer with the stone loaded in his truck bed. Ray Montoya came over in the spring of 1972. He had drip irrigation on his main fields and had no plans to change that. But he had 40 acres of lighter soil on the north end of his property, where the drip lines weren't worth running. Asked Gus what he thought about trying stone mulch there. Gus told him the stones from the arroyo would likely be too rounded for good surface coverage. Said the flat fractured sandstone worked better. Said he knew a rancher east of Milan who had been clearing a rocky hillside pasture and would probably give the material away. Ray drove out to that ranch the following week. His North 40 went under stone mulch that fall. Gus sold the farm to his son, Vicente, in 1983. Vicente had worked the operation alongside his father since 1969. Knew the field as well as Gus did by then. The wire-bound notebooks, 11 of them by 1983, transferred with the deed. Vicente added 3 more before he retired in 2004. The stones are still there, not all original. Some have shifted over the years. Some have been replaced where they cracked or sank. Vicente replaces them the way you replace fence posts section by section, a few every year, so the whole thing never needs doing at once. Gus died in 1991 at the age of 82. He never put a drip system in the main bean field. Used the stone mulch from 1967 until he stopped farming. 24 consecutive years. The county average yield for pinto beans in Cibola County over that period ran about 1,550 pounds per acre. Gus averaged 2,210. Dr. Funke cited his operation in 2 more publications before she retired from NMSU in 1984. The second one, from 1979, included a photograph of the field taken from the county road. You can see the road texture clearly. Stones between every row, edge to edge, all the way to the far fence line. In the photograph, Gus is standing at the near end of the first row. He has his hands in his pockets. He's looking at the field, not the camera. The brochure Sorel left on the hood of the truck in June of 1967 is still in the glove box of the pickup, as far as Vicente knows. The truck sits in the shed behind the house. Vicente hasn't gotten around to clearing it out. Elena's garden is still there too. Same dimensions, same east wall. Some of her original rocks still border the tomato rows. Nobody moved them. The beans are still growing in that field, still under stone, still doing what they've done since 1967. What rocks do when you know how to use